Welcome back to English Learning Conversations. I'm Aurora, and today we have a special episode designed specifically for intermediate English learners who are ready to challenge themselves with more complex listening and speaking practice. I'm joined by Thomas, who has been helping intermediate students break through to advanced levels for over 12 years. Thomas, could you start by telling us about your background and what makes intermediate practice so unique?
Absolutely, Aurora. I'm Thomas, originally from the United States, but I've taught English in 15 different countries, working primarily with intermediate students. What fascinates me about the intermediate level is that it's where language learning becomes truly sophisticated. You're no longer just learning basic grammar patterns and vocabulary. You're developing the ability to express complex ideas, understand cultural nuances, and navigate the ambiguity that exists in real-world communication. Intermediate learners are at a crucial transition point where they move from structured language learning to authentic language use.
That transition sounds both exciting and challenging. What specific characteristics distinguish intermediate listening from beginner listening comprehension?
Intermediate listening involves processing multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. While beginners focus on identifying basic information like who, what, and when, intermediate listeners must understand implications, recognize speakers' attitudes and emotions, follow complex logical arguments, and pick up on cultural references and humor. They're also dealing with natural speech phenomena like overlapping dialogue, interruptions, topic shifts, and varying speech speeds. Additionally, intermediate listeners encounter more sophisticated vocabulary, including abstract concepts, idiomatic expressions, and specialized terminology depending on the context.
Those are significantly more complex cognitive tasks. How should intermediate learners approach developing these advanced listening skills?
I recommend what I call strategic listening practice. First, develop your ability to listen for different purposes. Sometimes you're listening for specific information, other times for general understanding, and sometimes to evaluate arguments or detect bias. Second, practice with authentic materials that weren't created for language learners. News broadcasts, podcast discussions, university lectures, and workplace meetings. Third, work on building your listening stamina. Intermediate learners need to maintain concentration for longer periods, often 30 minutes to an hour. Fourth, learn to manage uncertainty. You won't understand everything, and that's normal. The skill is in understanding enough to participate meaningfully while continuing to learn from context.
That strategic approach makes so much sense. What role does prediction play in intermediate listening comprehension?
Prediction is absolutely crucial at the intermediate level. Advanced listeners don't just passively receive information. They actively predict what speakers will say next based on context, topic knowledge, and understanding of discourse patterns. For example, when someone starts with, on one hand, you can predict they'll present a contrasting point with, on the other hand. When you hear, the problem is, you expect an explanation of difficulties followed by potential solutions. This predictive ability allows intermediate listeners to follow rapid speech and recover quickly when they miss specific words or phrases.
That predictive skill sounds like it would significantly reduce the cognitive load of listening. Let's shift to speaking. What makes intermediate speaking practice different from beginner speaking?
Intermediate speaking is about developing fluency, precision, and adaptability, rather than just basic communication. At this level, you're learning to express complex and abstract ideas, tell detailed narratives with proper sequencing and emphasis, participate in debates and discussions where you must respond to others' points, adapt your register and style for different audiences and purposes, use language strategically to persuade, negotiate, or influence, and manage longer speaking turns while maintaining listener engagement. It's no longer just about making yourself understood. It's about communicating effectively and appropriately.
Those speaking goals are much more sophisticated. What specific practice techniques help intermediate learners develop these advanced speaking abilities?
I use several targeted practice methods. Extended discourse practice involves speaking on complex topics for 5 to 10 minutes without notes, developing your ability to organize and present ideas coherently. Impromptu speaking challenges help build fluency under pressure. I give students random topics and they must speak immediately for 2 to 3 minutes. Conversation management practice teaches skills like redirecting discussions, asking sophisticated follow-up questions, and gracefully disagreeing with others. Role-play scenarios simulate real-world situations like leading meetings, giving presentations, or handling customer complaints. Finally, Analytical speaking practice involves explaining processes, comparing options, or evaluating proposals using appropriate academic or professional language.
These practice methods sound very comprehensive. How important is register awareness for intermediate English users?
Register awareness becomes critical at the intermediate level. Intermediate speakers must learn to adjust their formality level, vocabulary choices, and grammatical structures based on their audience and purpose. Speaking to your supervisor requires different language than speaking to close friends. Academic presentations use different structures than casual storytelling. Professional emails require different vocabulary than text messages. Intermediate learners need to recognize these differences when listening and apply them appropriately when speaking. Mismatched register can create awkward situations or undermine your credibility, even when your grammar and vocabulary are technically correct.
That social aspect of language use is so important. What listening challenges do intermediate learners face when dealing with different English varieties and accents?
Accent diversity presents significant challenges for intermediate listeners. At this level, you're encountering not just standard American or British English, but also regional varieties, international English speakers, and non-native accents. Each variety has different pronunciation patterns, vocabulary preferences, and even grammatical variations. The key is developing flexibility rather than trying to master every accent. I recommend choosing one primary variety to focus on initially, then gradually expanding exposure to others. Learn to listen for content rather than getting distracted by unfamiliar pronunciation patterns. Practice with international speakers who use English as a second language, since much global English communication happens between non-native speakers.
That's practical advice about building flexibility. How can intermediate learners improve their ability to understand and use humor, sarcasm, and indirect communication?
Understanding and using subtle communication requires deep cultural knowledge and extensive exposure to authentic interactions. Humor often relies on shared cultural references, wordplay, timing, and delivery that textbooks can't teach effectively. Start by observing patterns. Notice how native speakers use tone, pauses, and emphasis to signal humor or sarcasm. Pay attention to context clues that indicate when someone isn't being literal. Practice with comedy shows, podcast banter, and social media interactions where humor is common. For your own speaking, start with safe humor, like self-deprecating comments or gentle observations about shared experiences. Remember that humor is culturally specific, so learn the conventions of the English-speaking culture you're most interested in.
Cultural competence really does add that crucial layer. What about handling complex listening situations like conference calls, academic lectures, or group discussions?
These challenging listening environments require specific preparation strategies. For conference calls, familiarize yourself with technical vocabulary and common phrases used in your field. Practice listening with audio-only input since you won't have visual cues. For academic lectures, develop note-taking skills that work in real time. Learn to identify main points versus supporting details, and practice following logical argument structures. For group discussions, work on tracking multiple speakers, understanding interruption patterns, and recognizing when speakers are building on versus disagreeing with previous points. In all cases, don't hesitate to ask for clarification politely. Phrases like, "Could you elaborate on that point?" or "I want to make sure I understand correctly" are professional and appropriate.
Those are excellent strategies for real-world listening challenges. How should intermediate learners practice expressing and supporting complex opinions?
Opinion expression at the intermediate level requires sophisticated language structures and logical organization. Practice using opinion markers with varying degrees of certainty. I'm convinced that. It seems to me that. I tend to think, or I'm somewhat skeptical about. Learn to support your opinions with evidence, examples, personal experience, or logical reasoning. Practice acknowledging counter-arguments before presenting your position. While some people argue that X, I believe Y because. Develop your ability to qualify statements appropriately rather than making absolute claims. Work on transition language that shows relationships between ideas. Furthermore, however, on the contrary. As a result, most importantly, practice active listening to others' opinions so you can respond thoughtfully, rather than just waiting for your turn to speak.
Those language structures would definitely make opinions sound more sophisticated and persuasive. What role does vocabulary depth play in intermediate listening and speaking?
Vocabulary at the intermediate level is about precision, nuance, and contextual appropriateness rather than just breadth. You need to understand that words like argue, claim, suggest, and insist have different connotations and implications. Learn word families and collocations, knowing that we say heavy rain, but strong wind, or that we make decisions but take breaks. Develop sensitivity to register, understanding when words are formal, informal, technical, or outdated. For listening, this means recognizing when familiar words are used with unfamiliar meanings. For speaking, this means choosing words that precisely convey your intended meaning and are appropriate for your audience and purpose.
That precision in vocabulary choice really does elevate communication quality. How can intermediate learners develop better conversation management skills?
Conversation management involves both linguistic and strategic skills. Learn signal phrases that help you control conversation flow. Before we move on, going back to what you said earlier, that raises an interesting point, or let me build on that idea. Practice asking sophisticated follow-up questions that deepen discussions rather than just keeping them going. Develop techniques for gracefully changing topics when necessary. That's fascinating, and it actually reminds me of something related, or speaking of X, I've been wondering about Y. Learn to summarize and synthesize others' contributions to show you're listening actively. Practice diplomatic ways to disagree or challenge ideas without attacking the person presenting them.
Those conversation management skills sound essential for professional and academic contexts. What mistakes do intermediate learners commonly make that limit their progress?
Several patterns consistently limit intermediate learners' advancement. Over-reliance on safe, simple structures instead of experimenting with more complex language features. Avoiding challenging content because it's difficult, which prevents exposure to advanced language patterns. Focusing too much on accuracy at the expense of fluency and natural expression. Practicing only with other non-native speakers instead of seeking exposure to native speaker interactions. Neglecting the cultural and pragmatic aspects of language in favor of purely linguistic elements. Not developing tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty in communication. Finally, setting perfectionist standards that prevent them from taking the risks necessary for language growth.
Those are important patterns to be aware of and avoid. How can intermediate learners assess their readiness to transition to advanced practice?
Several indicators suggest readiness for advanced level challenges. You can follow most native speaker conversations about familiar topics without intense concentration. You can express complex ideas and abstract concepts with reasonable fluency and precision. You understand implied meanings, humor, and cultural references in most contexts. You can adapt your speaking style appropriately for different audiences and purposes. You're comfortable with some ambiguity in conversations and don't panic when encountering unfamiliar expressions. You can participate meaningfully in group discussions and contribute original ideas. You can understand and produce extended discourse like presentations or detailed explanations. If you recognize these capabilities, you're ready for advanced level practice.
Those are excellent benchmarks for self-assessment. What resources do you recommend for intermediate listening and speaking practice?
I recommend a mix of structured and authentic materials. For listening, try TED Talks on topics you're passionate about, news podcasts that discuss current events in depth, university lectures available online, and documentary films that explore complex subjects. For speaking practice, join online discussion groups focused on your interests, participate in virtual book clubs or professional networking events, practice with AI conversation partners that can provide immediate feedback, and record yourself giving presentations or explanations on complex topics. The key is choosing content that challenges you intellectually while remaining linguistically accessible.
Those resources provide excellent variety and challenge. What's your most important advice for intermediate learners working to reach advanced proficiency?
My most important advice is to embrace complexity and seek out authentic challenges rather than staying in your comfort zone. Intermediate level isn't a plateau to remain on. It's a launching pad for advanced proficiency. Actively seek content and conversations that push your limits. Don't avoid difficult topics or complex discussions because you're worried about making mistakes. Engage with native speakers whenever possible, even if the conversations are challenging. Focus on developing your ability to communicate effectively in real-world situations, rather than just demonstrating textbook knowledge. Most importantly, be patient with the process. The intermediate to advanced transition requires time because you're developing sophisticated linguistic and cultural intuitions, not just memorizing new rules.
That's inspiring advice about embracing challenge and complexity. Thomas, thank you so much for sharing these advanced techniques for intermediate listening and speaking practice. I think our intermediate listeners now have a clear understanding of what they need to focus on to reach advanced proficiency.
Thank you, Aurora. It's been wonderful discussing these strategies with you. I hope intermediate learners feel motivated to push beyond their current limitations and explore the rich complexity of advanced English communication. Remember, you already have strong foundations. Now it's time to build the sophisticated skills that will serve you in any English-speaking environment.
And thank you to all our intermediate listeners. You've already achieved something remarkable by reaching this level. Now it's time to challenge yourself with more complex, authentic English use. The techniques Thomas shared today will help you develop the nuanced communication skills that distinguish advanced speakers from intermediate ones.
Exactly. Intermediate learners have tremendous potential waiting to be unlocked. Don't underestimate your abilities, but also don't underestimate the work required to reach advanced proficiency. Every challenging conversation, every complex podcast, every sophisticated discussion you engage with is building your advanced English competence.
Until next time, this is Aurora from English Learning Conversations. Keep challenging yourself, keep seeking authentic communication opportunities, and remember that advanced proficiency is the natural next step in your English learning journey. You have everything you need to get there. Now go use it. Goodbye, everyone.
Farewell, and may your English conversations become increasingly sophisticated, meaningful, and rewarding.